Today's topic is living and working conditions and the rise of unions in industrial America. The immigrant poor lived in overcrowded, unsanitary, and unsafe housing. Many lived in tenements, which were dumbbell-shaped brick apartment buildings 4 to 6 stories in height. In the year 1900, 2/3 of Manhattan's residents lived in these tenements. In one New York tenement, up to 18 people lived in each apartment. Each apartment had a wood-burning stove and a concrete bathtub in the kitchen, which when covered with plank served as a dining table. Before the year 1901, residents used rear yard outhouses to go to the bathroom. Afterward, 2 common toilets were installed on each floor. In the summer, children sometimes slept on the fire escape. Tenants typically paid $10 a month in rent. In tenements, many apartments were dark and airless because interior windows faced narrow, lit shafts, if there were interior windows at all. Because of this, diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis spread quickly. Danish immigrant Jacob Riis, a photojournalist and police reporter, ventured into the tenement buildings of New York City and began taking pictures of the residents there as he tried to capture the essence of poverty and the ways in which these poor Americans lived. He published his photos along with a detailed description of what he saw and experienced in the slums in a book titled How the Other Half Lives in 1890. Let's take a look at some of his photos. While you're viewing the photographs, I'm going to read you an excerpt from his book. Be a little careful, please. The hall is dark, and you might stumble over the children dropping pennies back there. Not that it would hurt them. Kicks and cuffs are their daily diet. They have little else. Here, where the hall turns and dives into utter darkness, is a step, and another, a flight of stairs. You can feel your way if you cannot see it. Close? Yes. What would you have? All the fresh air that ever enters these stairs comes from the hall door that is forever slamming, from the windows of dark bedrooms that in turn receive from the stairs their sole supply of the elements God meant to be free, but man deals out with such ungenerous hand. That was a woman filling her pail by the hydrant you just bumped against. The sinks are in the hallway, that all the tenants may have access, and all be poisoned alike by their summer stenches. Hear the pump squeak. It is a lullaby of tenement house babies. In summer, when 1,000 thirsty throats pant for a cooling drink in this block, it is worked in vain. But the saloon, whose open door you pass in the hall, is always there. The smell of it has followed you up. Here is a door. Listen. That short, hacking cough, that tiny, helpless wail. What do they mean? The child is dying with measles. With half a chance it might have lived, but it had none. That dark bedroom killed it. What if the words ring in your ears as we grope our way up the stairs and down from floor to floor, listening to the sounds behind the closed door, some of quarreling, some of coarse songs, more of profanity. When the summer heats come with their suffering, they have meaning more terrible than words can tell. Come over here. Step carefully over this baby. It is a baby, spite of its rags and dirt, under these iron bridges called fire escapes, but loaded down, despite the never-ending watchfulness of the firemen, with broken household goods, with washtubs and barrels over which no man could climb from a fire. This gap between dingy brick walls is the yard. That strip of smoke-colored sky up there is the heaven of these people. Do you wonder the name does not attract them to the churches? That baby's parents live in the rear tenement here. She is at least as clean as the steps we are now climbing. There are plenty of houses with 100 such in. The tenement is more like the one in front we just left, only fouler, closer, darker. We will not say more cheerless. The word is a mockery. 100,000 people lived in rear tenements in New York last year. Here is a room neater than the rest. The woman, a stout matron with hard lines of care in her face, at the washtub. I try to keep the children clean, she says, apologetically, but with a hopeless glance around. The spice of hot soap suds is added to the air, already tainted with the smell of boiling cabbage, of rags, and uncleanliness about it. It makes an overpowering mixture. The 25-cent lodging house keeps up the deception of a bedroom, though the head-high partition enclosing a space just large enough to hold a cot and a chair and allow the man room to pull off his clothes is a shallow deception. The 15-cent bed stands boldly forth, without screen, in a room full of bunks, with sheets as yellow and blankets as foul. At the 10-cent level, the locker for the sleeper's clothes disappears. There is no longer need of it. Usually, the 10 and 7-cent lodgings are different grades of the same abomination. Uneasy sleepers roll off at intervals, but they have not far to fall to the next tier of bunks, and the commotion that ensues is speedily quieted by the boss and his club. On cold winter nights, when every bunk has its tenant, I have stood in such a lodging room more than once, and listening to the snoring of the sleepers like the regular strokes of an engine, and the slow creaking of the beams under their restless weight, imagined myself on shipboard and experienced the very real nausea of seasickness. The one thing did not favor the deception was the air. Its character could not be mistaken. Like living conditions in urban America, working conditions for many were subpar. One of the most dangerous and hazardous jobs was that of a coal mine worker, who were mostly young men in their teens. Factory workers toiled in sweatshops, often 6 days a week, for very little pay. They were given few if any breaks, no paid sick leave, and could be fired at the whim of the foreman for things such as talking while working. Most factory workers had to meet daily quotas in order to leave for the day. This type of work was often piecework, meaning that workers were paid based on how many pieces they produced. Others worked in an assembly line fashion as a result of reports on the efficiency of the division of labor. Factory owners found that products could be made faster and cheaper if they divided up the process into shorter, simple tasks that anyone, skilled or not, could achieve. This led to a justification for lower wages and for punishment if a task wasn't completed on time, as it held up the entire line. Like Riis's portrayal of life in the tenements, Louis Hine, a sociologist and photographer, used his photography skills to capture the hardships of the working poor in factories and coal mines. Hine's illustration of working condition emphasizes the plight of children as he fought to end child labor in the United States. His documentary photography aided the National Child Labor Commission in their efforts to prevent the use and abuse of children in American factories and other dangerous jobs. The plight of America's poor was captured in photographs by these two great photojournalists. Their efforts helped promote awareness of the deplorable conditions in which many Americans, mostly immigrants, lived and worked. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy to force changes in America's labor laws. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company experienced a fire that caused the deaths of approximately 146 women and young girls, many of whom were trapped inside or jumped to their deaths. We'll be watching a short documentary on the tragedy in class and discussing the impact that it had on working conditions and labor laws in America. Remember this cartoon from the first lecture? This cartoon looks at the industrial wedge, or a gap, that was placed between the rich industrialists and their poor workers. Labor leaders such as Samuel Gompers began to organize workers and bring complaints directly to employers. Gompers is quoted as saying, "What shall the workers do? Sit idly by and see the vast resources of nature and the human mind be utilized and monopolized for the benefit of the few? No. Laborers must learn to think and act, and soon too, that only by the power of organization and common concert of action can their rights to life be recognized and liberty and rights secured." So clearly, workers felt that they were entitled to certain rights their employers were violating. This map shows areas of the country where strikes broke out. So unions would organize, and many of them would organize strikes in order to try to change working conditions. So during the industrial era, strikes were very common, and many of them often turned violent. Many workers chose to form labor unions in order to change working conditions. One national labor union that aimed to organize all working men and women, skilled and unskilled, was the Knights of Labor, led by Terence Powderly. It demanded equal pay for equal work, which dealt with the issue that women made less than men for the same job, an 8-hour workday, and ended child labor. But after a series of failed strikes, the Knights of Labor fell off the map during the 1890s. Another national union was the American Federation of Labor, which was led by Samuel Gompers. It's different from the Knights of Labor because it was a craft union, meaning that it only allowed skilled workers and then divided them into smaller unions based on their specific craft. It didn't allow women or African Americans, both of whom were accepted by the Knights. The American Federation of Labor felt that minority groups drove down wages and therefore didn't want them involved in their union. They focused on fair wages, working hours, and conditions. They used strikes and boycotts against employers to try to force them to comply with their demands. This chart looks at the methods used by workers to have their demands met, as well as the methods used by employers to prevent unions from making any gains. So on the one hand, we have things that employers did to try to prevent unions from making some progress. So the first term on here is a scab, and a scab, similar to a scab if you got cut, was a person who took the place of a worker who was on strike. So strikes only work because when you go on strike, you close down the company that you're working for. So if all the teachers go on strike, then school closes down. That's supposed to put pressure on the school board, the administration, whatever, to do what the teachers want them to do. But if they can hire people to replace the teachers, right, the scabs, then it doesn't matter that they're on strike because the school can continue going on its business, just like with a company if the workers go on strike. So they use scabs to try to downplay the effectiveness of a strike. Pinkertons were the secret police that would come in and break up strikes, often with violence. Many cases, workers were killed during a strike by Pinkertons, these police officers. They could use a lockout. You hear this a lot with sports. There was the NFL lockout last year. A lockout is when employers, they refuse to negotiate with the workers until certain demands are met, so they don't allow them to come to work. And obviously, if you can't come to work, you can't make any money. So it's kind of like the employer's strike, right? There was something that you can compare it to. They would also engage in blacklisting. So if you were a worker who was known to be very active in a union and kind of voice your opinion, you could be blacklisted, meaning that other business owners would know that you were kind of a troublemaker and it would prevent you from getting another job in the future. They also sometimes forced employees to sign yellow dog contracts. A yellow dog is kind of a metaphor for somebody who is scared. So yellow dog contract was a contract that you had to sign saying you would not join a union, and if you did, you would lose your job. They would also get court injunctions. Basically, the court would force the unions to stop striking or stop doing whatever it was that they were doing. So they would often use their money and their legal counsel to actually get the courts involved to stop the unions from fighting back. Final method is an open shop. That means they would hire both union and non-union workers. Because if not all the workers are in a union, they're not all going to participate in the strike or boycott. It just makes it less effective. So on the other side, you have the methods used by workers or the unions. The first one is a boycott. So a boycott would be the refusal to buy a good or a service to put economic pressure on a business that was doing something that you didn't agree with. So they would organize boycotts around businesses that were not treating their workers well. Also informational picketing, like going out in the public, handing out pamphlets, whatever they needed to do to let the people know what the company was doing, whether they were using child labor or not paying their workers well, or the conditions were dangerous, just try to get the public sympathy and get the public on their side. The third method is a closed shop. So if an open shop allows union and non-union workers, a closed shop only allows union workers. They would actually get company to, as part of a negotiation, agree to a closed shop. So only union workers could work for this company, and that makes the union a lot stronger. Of course, another method is an organized strike, right? Going on strike closes down the business, kind of forces the employers to back off a little bit and work with the union. And then a final method is collective bargaining, where the two sides sit down with a mediator and negotiate and try to work out their differences. And we're actually going to do a simulation with collective bargaining in class. Okay, so make sure that you have the following definitions in your notebook, right? So all the terms on the previous slide, you want to have a definition for them, as well as all these other individuals, groups, etc. that I just discussed. Also, you want to make sure that you write your summary on your Google Doc and that you've answered the think questions. And make sure you come to class with any questions that you have if you need clarification on anything.